The grand chandelier trembled as candlelight flickered across the polished mahogany floors of the Pembroke estate, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air smelled of roasted meat and spilled wine, mingling with the subtle metallic scent of power and fear. 11 servants moved silently through the hallways, invisible yet indispensable, carrying trays, lighting lamps, and sweeping floors while the family above indulged in excess. Among them, Elias stood still, hands folded, eyes sharp, watching every movement, every glance, every whisper. He was a slave, yet in his mind, he was already plotting a slow, deliberate rebellion, not of brute force, but of patience, intelligence, and a meticulous understanding of the cruelty that had defined his life. This is the story of how one young man, enslaved and ordered to violate his own morality, turned the twisted games of his masters into a masterclass of justice. Before we step deeper into this dark chapter, pause and consider. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below, and if tales of cunning, calculated vengeance intrigue you, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been hidden in the shadows of a southern estate for generations. Elias had learned early on that visibility was danger. Every glance, every whispered word, every movement could either save his life or end it. He had grown up among the Pembroke estate's corridors, absorbing the rhythms of power, the hierarchy of cruelty, the subtleties of fear. The masters treated their domain like a chessboard, moving people like pawns, never noticing when one of those pawns started thinking, observing, learning. Elias had learned quickly. He had learned that survival depended not only on obedience but on perception, patience, and a quiet cunning. Tonight, however, the rules of survival had shifted. Summoned to the drawing room, Elias entered to find Master Pembroke seated in his high-backed chair, the flicker of lamplight dancing across his sharp, predatory face. His daughter, Lillian, reclined beside him, draped in fine silk, her eyes cold and calculating. She exuded the arrogance of privilege, a cruel beauty forged by wealth and indulgence. Elias's stomach knotted. He had learned fear long ago, but what he felt now was something deeper. Dread, and the chilling weight of an immoral order. "Elias," the master said, his voice smooth but imbued with menace, "you have been loyal, haven't you?" Elias inclined his head, his voice neutral. "Yes, Master Pembroke." "Good," the master continued, leaning forward. "I have a task for you, one of great importance." The words themselves were innocuous, but Elias sensed the trap within them. He had learned to read the subtleties in every inflection, every pause. The way Master Pembroke's hand lingered on the edge of the table, the almost imperceptible curl of Lillian's lips, everything spoke of a plan designed for cruelty. "You will ensure that my daughter Lillian becomes with child. You will see to it personally." The master's eyes glinted with the satisfaction of someone who believed himself untouchable. "It is for the continuation of our line, and you are the only one capable of carrying out such a delicate task without raising suspicion." Elias's heart stilled for a moment, a shockwave of horror passing through him. The order was clear, impossible, and immoral. To disobey could mean death. To obey was to violate his own humanity. The room seemed to close in around him, the flickering lamplight casting twisted shadows that seemed to leer at him, mocking his predicament. Lillian's laughter, soft and cruel, echoed through the drawing room. "Oh, how convenient," she purred, the words dripping with mockery. A slave entrusted with something so intimate. How amusing. Elias swallowed hard, forcing his expression into a mask of neutral obedience. He had learned long ago that any sign of rebellion or fear could be deadly. But beneath the calm exterior, his mind was already working, calculating, planning. He would obey for now, but he would not allow this to break him. He would not allow this order to strip away the last vestiges of his agency. Every observation, every word, every detail he noticed would be catalogued, stored, and used. Patience would be his weapon. Strategy would be his ally. He had seen cruelty before. He had survived it before. And now, he would endure it, not with submission, but with intention. The task set before him was not merely a violation, it was an invitation to turn the master's arrogance and cruelty against them. He would survive, he would endure, and one day, he would exact a justice that no chain could hold back. As Elias exited the drawing room, the weight of the command pressed heavily on his shoulders. But in that weight, there was also clarity. This was the moment that would define him. This was the spark that would ignite a long, patient plan. He would bide his time, watch every movement, learn every weakness, and one day, he would wield the power that had been denied him. The mansion, opulent and cruel, seemed to sigh with anticipation as he moved through its corridors. The masters were confident, oblivious to the storm gathering in the mind of the young slave. They did not know that within him burned a fire more dangerous than any blade or whip, a fire of intelligence, patience, and the desire for righteous vengeance. Elias had been ordered to violate his own morality. He had been commanded to serve cruelty in its most intimate form. But he had already begun to rewrite the rules. The game had changed, and when the time came, the masters would discover, too late, that the pawn they believed powerless had become the most dangerous force in the house. The days that followed Elias's command were fraught with tension, but he wore his mask well. His movements were slow, deliberate. He had learned long ago that the key to survival was invisibility, and now, more than ever, he had to blend into the background, watching, waiting for the right moment to act. He was the slave. He was supposed to be obedient, docile, to serve with no thought of his own desires or plans. But Elias had no intention of remaining the obedient servant. He had a mind sharper than any whip, and a spirit that could not be broken. The atmosphere in the house had shifted, just enough for Elias to feel it. It was subtle. Lillian's laughter no longer rang with the same venom. The master's steps seemed less assured as he moved through the halls, and the once luxurious meals felt less fulfilling to the family, as though they were gnawing on something far emptier than they realized. But Elias noticed every nuance, every slight deviation in their behavior. He had learned that when the world was in motion, it was in the details that the greatest truths could be found. Lillian, once so confident in her beauty and power, now seemed to carry a new burden. The way she held herself slightly stiffer, more calculated, betrayed the quiet dread she must have felt. She had become more of a prisoner in her own home, though she would never admit it. Her eyes, usually cold and filled with arrogance, now flickered with doubt whenever Elias crossed her path. The command her father had given, the one she had relished in the twisted privilege of possessing, had begun to weigh on her. And it was in these moments that Elias saw the cracks in her otherwise composed exterior. He watched her more closely now, learning her habits, understanding the rhythms of her day. Lillian had a routine one that, like clockwork, she followed each morning after breakfast. She would retire to her study, where she would engage in her drawing, a hobby she often boasted about, though few had ever seen the results of her work. Elias had no interest in her art. It was merely a way to get closer, to observe her vulnerabilities in the comfort of her own space. The first time Elias entered the study, he was careful to do so without being noticed. The door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, just wide enough to slip inside. He stood there for a moment, blending into the shadows, watching her work. She sat with her back to him, bent over her desk, a small lamp casting a soft glow over her features. Her delicate fingers moved skillfully over a sketchbook, but there was something in her posture that struck Elias. She was no longer the confident young woman who had commanded attention. Now, she was merely a girl, hiding behind her art, trying to escape the reality she had created for herself. Elias had to remind himself why he was there. He couldn't afford to be caught up in her presence. He couldn't let her beauty cloud his judgment. The command had been clear: impregnate her, serve as the means to an end for her father's twisted legacy. But Elias had never been one to obey without purpose. The plan was taking shape in his mind, and as he watched her, he saw the first opening. Days turned into weeks, and Elias kept to the shadows, carefully watching Lillian, observing her every move. He noted the small things, the way she sometimes glanced at the door as though waiting for something, the slight twitch in her fingers when she would run them through her hair, the sigh she let escape when she thought no one was listening. Her once flawless composure had begun to crack, just enough for him to see the vulnerability beneath. The house was full of secrets, but the most dangerous ones were hidden within Lillian herself. She wasn't the untouchable figure she portrayed. She was a young woman trapped by her own family's expectations, weighed down by her own desires and fears. Elias knew that if he could exploit that fear, if he could get close enough to her, he could manipulate her into seeing the truth of her own situation. She might be the daughter of the master, but she was still a pawn in the game her father played. But Lillian wasn't the only one Elias had to watch. Master Pembroke's eyes were always on him, even when he pretended to ignore the young slave's movements. The master was suspicious, never quite trusting Elias, but still maintaining his facade of kindness and ownership. Elias understood that to succeed, he had to play the game on both sides, appease the master while subtly undermining him. The power dynamics were delicate, and Elias knew that any slip-up could spell disaster. It was during one of these quiet moments of observation that Elias learned of Lillian's greatest weakness. One afternoon, as he entered the grand dining room to collect the dishes, he overheard a conversation between Lillian and her mother, a conversation that would change everything. "I cannot do it, Mother." Lillian's voice trembled with uncertainty. "Father's plan. It is wrong. I don't even know him. How can I?" Her mother's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. "You will do what is required of you. Do you think you have a choice? You think he's asking for too much? Think of the legacy we are building. Think of what it means for your future, for this family's place in history." The conversation continued, but Elias had already heard enough. He understood then Lillian was not just a willing participant in this twisted scheme. She was as much a victim of her father's manipulation as he was. This knowledge, this crack in her armor, gave Elias a new sense of purpose. He wasn't merely going to carry out the order. He was going to use this opportunity to subvert the power that had held him and so many others captive. If he could control her, if he could turn her fear into something that worked in his favor, he could turn the tables on the Pembrokes in ways they would never anticipate. As Elias left the room, he couldn't help but feel the stirrings of a plan beginning to take shape. The pieces were moving, and soon, very soon, he would have Lillian exactly where he wanted her. But first, he had to remain patient. He had to keep watching, keep observing, until the moment was right. The estate seemed quieter as the weeks passed, the air heavy with the tension of waiting. Elias had learned to move even more silently, his every step calculated to ensure that he was never seen or heard by those who still believed they held power over him. His mind had become a maze of plans, his thoughts always 2 steps ahead of the Pembrokes. He had carefully orchestrated every encounter with Lillian, watching her every move, learning her weaknesses, and finding the perfect moments to strike. The mansion was more than just a home for the wealthy family, it was a prison, a gilded cage that kept them all in a web of power and fear. Elias had become a shadow in this world, a quiet observer, but also a silent player in a game that only he fully understood. Lillian had grown increasingly uneasy in his presence, her once certain composure faltering whenever Elias appeared. Her father's command, and the implications of it, had begun to weigh heavily on her. She no longer carried herself with the same arrogance. Instead, she was constantly tense, her eyes darting away whenever Elias looked at her. Yet, despite her fear, she was still the daughter of a master, and that pride could never fully be erased. Tonight, the game would begin. The night air was thick with the promise of something inevitable. The household had settled into its familiar routine. Lillian had gone to her study, as she always did after dinner, to draw or read. Elias had spent the evening doing what he always did, cleaning, preparing, and making sure everything was in place. But tonight, there was a difference. Tonight, he had prepared something for her. Something that would change everything. The door to Lillian's study was slightly ajar, just as it always was when she worked late into the night. Elias had been watching her for days, learning her schedule, and tonight, she would follow the pattern he had carefully set. He had been patient. He had waited. Now, he was ready to take the first step in the long game he had been playing. Leaning against the doorframe, Elias waited for the right moment, his heartbeat steady, his mind focused. He could hear the soft scratch of Lillian's pencil against paper as she worked. She was lost in her art, unaware of the shift that had occurred, unaware that the roles of power had begun to change. The soft creak of the door barely made a sound as he stepped inside, his movements smooth and deliberate. Lillian didn't notice him at first. Her back turned to him as she sketched. Her golden hair fell loosely over her shoulders, a soft contrast to the tightness in her posture. "Miss Lillian," Elias said, his voice low, yet commanding. Lillian froze, her pencil hovering over the paper, and then slowly turned her head. Her face tightened, her eyes narrowing in discomfort. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, though there was a quiver in her voice. Elias knew she was trying to maintain control, but the tremble in her hands gave her away. "I've come to deliver what you requested," he said, his words carrying more weight than he intended. "Your father's command, the one you've been so eager to fulfill." Her eyes flickered with a mix of anger and fear. "I didn't." "Don't deny it, Miss Lillian. You know what's expected of you." "Your father's order was clear," Elias interrupted, his tone smooth but firm. He stepped closer to her, his presence filling the room, and she instinctively pulled back, her back stiff against the chair. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice trembling with a hint of desperation. "I don't want to." Elias stood over her now, his gaze unwavering. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear she tried so hard to hide. It was all part of the game. She thought she still had control, but in that moment, he knew the truth. She was as much a prisoner in this house as he was. She had been trapped by her father's command, just as much as he had been trapped by the legacy of slavery. The only difference now was that Elias held the power. "It's not about what you want, Miss Lillian. It's about what has been commanded," Elias said, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it. "But I didn't come here to force you into something you're not ready for." Lillian's eyes widened, her breath quickening. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice suddenly smaller, unsure. Elias smiled inwardly. This was the moment when the power shifted, when she would realize that the game was no longer hers to control. He stepped back slightly, just enough to create the illusion of distance. "I came to offer you a choice," Elias said, his voice low and deliberate. "Your father may have given the order, but you are not bound by it." "Not yet." Lillian's gaze sharpened, suspicion creeping into her eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice almost accusing. Elias leaned closer, his words hanging between them like a carefully calculated threat. "I can help you. I can make sure you don't have to follow your father's orders. You don't have to be his puppet anymore. You don't have to be trapped by his command." The air between them seemed to pulse with the weight of his words. Lillian's breath hitched, and for the briefest moment, Elias could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope she had long since buried. "But in return, you will have to do something for me," Elias added, his voice steady but filled with unspoken meaning. "You will have to help me in ways you may not understand yet." Lillian opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was frozen, her mind racing as she processed what he had said. Elias knew that the seed of doubt had been planted. The game had shifted. And now, it was not just about obeying her father's command, it was about survival, about playing the game with intelligence and cunning. "I'll give you time to think about it," Elias said, his tone softening just enough to make it seem like he was offering her a reprieve. "But remember, freedom comes with a cost." Lillian stood there, her face pale, her body trembling as she absorbed his words. Elias knew that he had just taken the first step in their twisted dance of power. The next move would be hers, but he had already set the wheels of manipulation in motion. He turned and left the study without another word, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The door closed softly behind him, and as he walked away, a strange sense of triumph filled him. The game had begun, and he was playing it on his terms. The days following their first interaction were filled with a quiet, intense tension. Elias had carefully set his trap, but now it was up to Lillian to decide whether she would fall into the snare he had woven or try to break free. He had given her the illusion of choice, but in reality, the power had already shifted. He had planted the seeds of doubt in her mind, and that was enough for now. The rest would unfold on its own. Lillian's behavior changed over the next few days. She no longer carried herself with the same arrogance. Her movements were slower, more measured. Elias saw the small signs, the way her hands trembled slightly when she picked up a book, the way she hesitated before speaking, her eyes darting around the room as though she was constantly searching for an escape. She had never been as strong as she pretended to be, and now that he had shown her the cracks in her armor, she couldn't hide the vulnerability any longer. One evening, as Elias entered the mansion's grand hallway, he saw Lillian standing at the top of the stairs, her figure outlined by the soft light of a nearby candle. For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant, as though she were trying to come to terms with something that had shaken her to her core. She looked down at him, and for the first time, Elias saw the hesitation in her eyes. "Elias," she said, her voice low and uncertain. "I've been thinking about what you said." Elias nodded, taking a step closer but maintaining the distance between them. "And what have you decided?" Lillian didn't answer right away. She seemed to weigh her words carefully, her gaze flickering to the side, avoiding his eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice tinged with both fear and defiance. "I can't do what my father wants. I know it's wrong, but what if I'm trapped? What if there's no way out?" Elias studied her, his mind working quickly. She was beginning to see the trap she had been placed in, but she still wasn't ready to accept that she had more power than she realized. The chains of her upbringing, the way she had been taught to obey, were still too strong, but that too would change. "You are trapped," Elias said quietly, his voice calm but filled with the weight of truth. "But only because you believe you have no choice. Your father's orders aren't the only things that bind you." Lillian's brow furrowed, confusion crossing her face. "What do you mean?" Elias took a slow step toward her, closing the distance just enough to make her feel his presence without overwhelming her. "You have the power to choose. You have the power to decide who you become in this world. You don't have to be your father's pawn." Lillian looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read his intentions. "But if I go against him, what happens? If I defy him, won't I lose everything?" Elias could see the struggle in her, the battle between fear and the desire for something more. She wanted to break free, but the chains of her upbringing were tightly wrapped around her, and she didn't know how to sever them. "No," Elias said firmly, his voice low. "If you defy him, you'll gain everything. Your father's wealth, his power, they mean nothing. You have the power to shape your own future, Lillian. You just have to be brave enough to take it." She remained silent, her gaze flickering between him and the ground. She was beginning to understand, but the weight of what he was asking of her was still too great for her to fully grasp. She had lived her life believing that her family's power was absolute, that her position in society was unshakable. To defy her father would mean giving up everything she had ever known. And yet, in that moment, Elias saw something in her, a spark of defiance, a flicker of the strength she had buried deep within herself. She wasn't the delicate, fragile girl she had always played at being. She was capable of more, if only she could see it. "What do you want from me, Elias?" Lillian's voice was quiet, but there was a trace of determination in it now, something Elias hadn't heard before. Elias considered her words carefully, choosing his next ones with precision. "I want you to understand that you are not powerless. You have the choice, Lillian. You can either remain trapped in your father's game, or you can take control. The choice is yours." Lillian's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came. She seemed lost in thought, the weight of his words settling on her like a heavy cloak. Elias could see the internal battle raging within her. She wanted to defy her father, but the consequences seemed too great, too dangerous. But she wasn't alone. Elias was here, and he would help her navigate the treacherous waters that lay ahead. Together, they could turn the tide, expose the corruption and cruelty that had held them both captive for so long. Lillian finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his for the first time without fear, without hesitation. "I'll think about it," she said softly, almost as if she were making a vow. Elias nodded, his gaze steady. "Think about it, yes. But remember, time is not on our side. Your father will act soon. You must decide quickly." As he turned to leave, his heart beat steadily, his resolve unshaken. The pieces were moving. Lillian was beginning to see the truth. It would take time, but the game was now in motion. Elias had become more than just a slave to her. He had become her guide, her confidant, and perhaps, in the end, her salvation. And as he stepped into the shadows, he felt the weight of the plan settle over him, the certainty of what was to come. He was no longer just a pawn in their game. He was the player. The time for action was fast approaching. But for now, he had to wait. Patience, after all, was the key to victory. The days that followed were a careful dance, one where Elias led and Lillian followed, though at times her steps were hesitant, as if she were unsure of where the path would ultimately lead. But the seeds of doubt were now deeply planted, and Elias could see the cracks beginning to widen in the walls of her loyalty to her father. Lillian was at war with herself. She was beginning to realize that she had the power to choose, but every step she took toward defying her father pulled her further into dangerous territory. Elias was patient, watching her every movement, analyzing every word she spoke. He knew the time would come when she would make her choice, but that choice had to be hers, and it had to be made without hesitation. That was the only way to ensure that she would stand by him when the moment of reckoning came. It was late one night when Elias received the news that would set everything into motion. The household had gone quiet, as it always did after dinner, when the masters retired to their chambers and the slaves went about their evening tasks. But tonight, there was a different energy in the air. Whispers spread like wildfire through the house, carried by the other servants. The plan had been set into motion. Lillian's father, Master Pembroke, had arranged a marriage for her, a marriage that would tie her even closer to the power he held. Lillian had tried to escape it, tried to rebel, but in the end, she had no choice. The weight of her family's expectations was too great, the pressure too intense. The marriage had been arranged for the following week. It was a decision made not out of love, but out of power, an attempt to solidify Master Pembroke's legacy and control over his wealth and property. Elias could see the finality in it. It wasn't just a marriage, it was the end of Lillian's last illusion of freedom. Elias had known this moment would come. He had anticipated it, but even now, as he stood in the dimly lit hallway, listening to the muffled voices of the other slaves, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. This wasn't just a matter of Lillian's rebellion, it was a matter of timing, of making sure that she could be pushed far enough to act before she was forced to marry a man she loathed. The next morning, as the household went about its daily routine, Elias watched Lillian with a new sense of urgency. The time to act was now. He could see the strain in her eyes as she moved through the house, her every step slower than usual, her face pale with the weight of what was to come. She knew that this marriage would bind her to a life of servitude in her father's name, just as Elias had been bound to servitude in his. She was, in her own way, a slave, a prisoner in her own house. Their eyes met as she passed by him in the hallway, and for a brief moment there was an understanding between them. She didn't need to say anything. Elias knew. The marriage was the final straw. She was ready to act. That evening, when the household had settled into its usual rhythms, Elias found Lillian in the garden, standing by the fountain, her hands trembling as she ran them over the cold stone. She was a woman on the verge of a breakdown, caught between the life she had always known and the one she could not bring herself to accept. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind. "I can't go through with it. I won't." Elias approached her, his presence calm and steady, as always. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when Lillian would no longer be able to deny the truth. "You don't have to," he said quietly, his voice low and assuring. "You can choose, Lillian. You can stop this." Her eyes flickered with something, a spark of hope, a flicker of rebellion. But she was still afraid. "How?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "You already know how," Elias replied, his voice firm. "You've been given everything you need to make this decision. You just have to make it." Lillian's eyes searched his face, her breath quickening. "And if I do? If I choose to defy him, what then?" Elias stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. Then we fight. We take back what's ours. We do it together. Lillian hesitated for a long moment, and then, as if something inside her broke, she nodded. I'll do it. I'll go through with it. I'll marry him, but only to use it against them. The words hung in the air like an unspoken vow. This was the moment Elias had been waiting for, the moment when Lillian finally understood her power, when she realized that she was no longer a pawn in her father's game. She was a player, and she would play the game to win. But Elias knew that her decision, while powerful, would come at a cost. There was no turning back now. If Lillian married the man her father had chosen, it would cement her position within the Pembroke family, and with it, the power they wielded. But it was also the perfect opportunity for Elias to use her rebellion to his advantage. He had already begun planning. There were other forces at work, slaves who had seen the rebellion rise, slaves who were ready to join the fight. Lillian's rebellion could spark something much larger, something that would take down the entire system of power and control that the Pembrokes had built. It wasn't just about taking revenge, it was about dismantling the very foundations of slavery itself. Lillian, now determined, turned to face him. What do we do next? Elias smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Next, we wait. But this time, we wait with purpose. The game has only just begun. The estate was quiet, too quiet. The once dominant presence of Master Pembroke, his loud commands and pompous stride, had dissipated over the last few days. His daughter's defiance had already shaken the walls of their carefully constructed world. But what Elias knew, and what Lillian was now beginning to understand, was that the storm was only just beginning. She had chosen to take control, and while that was a victory, it also meant stepping into a much larger, far more dangerous game. Elias had bided his time long enough. In those quiet moments, in the darkness of the estate's sprawling halls, he had observed, listened, and waited for the right moment to move. But now, with Lillian's decision made, the pieces were moving faster. It wasn't just about her rebellion, it was about setting a fire that would consume everything the Pembrokes stood for, everything they had ever believed. The night after Lillian had agreed to marry her father's choice, Elias found himself standing in the garden once again, staring at the distant horizon. The air was thick with anticipation, the smell of rain hanging just at the edge of the evening breeze. He had come to a crossroads. He had given Lillian the knowledge, the understanding of her own power, but now he had to act. And in that action, there could be no turning back. The master's house would fall, and so too would those who had made him a tyrant. Lillian joined him moments later, her steps quiet but firm. Her face was drawn, pale from the weight of the decision she had made. But there was something else in her eyes' resolve. The moment she had looked into his eyes and said the words, "I'll do it," she had begun to change. The rebellion had started with one person, but the spark was now spreading. What Elias had set in motion was not just about breaking free from the Pembrokes. It was about rewriting the entire history of their oppression. "You're sure?" Elias asked, his voice a low murmur in the night. "I'm sure," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with a mix of fear and excitement. "But what now, Elias? How do we stop them? They will come for me when they find out. My father will make sure of it." Elias turned to face her, his eyes intense, filled with the knowledge of what needed to be done. "We'll make sure they never come for you. We'll make sure you never have to marry him. But we do it on our terms. We don't wait for them to come for us. We strike first." Lillian's eyes widened, her breath quickening. "Strike first?" Her voice trembled as she spoke, the enormity of what Elias was suggesting hitting her all at once. "You mean take action? But how? We're just slaves, Elias. We have no power." "Not yet," Elias replied, his voice calm but filled with a cold certainty. "But the plan has already begun. You've already made the first step. Now we move quickly. We use what we've learned, what we've seen. We know their weaknesses. We know their arrogance." Lillian's gaze sharpened as she listened, the initial shock beginning to fade, replaced by the hunger for something more. She wasn't just listening to Elias now. She was beginning to hear the truth in his words. "What do you want me to do?" Elias smiled, the first time in days that he had allowed himself the briefest glimmer of satisfaction. Everything we've been waiting for. The time has come to reveal your power, to expose your father for what he truly is. We start by taking the people around him, his allies, his right-hand men, those who help him maintain control. We tear down his system piece by piece. Lillian stepped closer, her heart racing. And how do we do that? Tonight, Elias said, his voice quiet but urgent. You'll make sure your father gets a message. We'll make it look like the rebellion has already started. His eyes are on you now, so we'll use that to our advantage. The message will be simple. He's been outwitted. His time is running out. Lillian nodded slowly, the weight of the plan settling over her. She had never thought she would be capable of such things. Her life had been defined by her father's control. But now, Elias was showing her a path, a way to reclaim what had always been denied to her. They spent the next few hours preparing, quietly slipping through the halls of the estate, gathering what they needed. Elias knew that to make this plan work, they needed more than just cunning. They needed to be quick, precise, and ruthless. Every move had to be calculated, every word chosen with care. It was past midnight when Lillian finally stood before her father's door, holding the letter she had written in secret. The ink was still fresh, the words cold and precise. It was a declaration of rebellion, but it was also a warning, a promise that the master's reign was coming to an end. The letter would be delivered by one of the house slaves, an ally Elias had cultivated in secret. The message would be clear, but the true game would unfold in the days to come. As Lillian stood there, her hand trembling slightly, Elias placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is the moment," he said, his voice quiet but filled with the urgency of what was to come. "Once this letter is delivered, they will start making their moves. They'll think it's the beginning of a slave revolt, but we'll turn that fear into our advantage." Lillian nodded, taking a deep breath. She understood now. This wasn't just about her defying her father. It was about setting the wheels in motion for something much larger, a rebellion that would take down the entire system of power, one that would leave the masters broken, defeated, and powerless. She placed the letter beneath the door, her fingers brushing the edge of the wood as she did. The action felt final, like a door closing on a life she had never truly lived. There would be no turning back now. As Lillian made her way back to the garden, Elias stood silently behind her, watching the world around him. The time for waiting was over. The battle had begun. They had taken the first step. And now, the Pembrokes would see that the rebellion had already started. The question was not whether they would fight back, but whether they could.